we're going to get started. If we could stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, we move the flag to the front to make it easy. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you so much for coming out. This is our last meeting of the season. I think we had a pretty good year. We had good attendance and great discussion. Excellent speakers and lively discussion afterwards. So it was a good year. Our financial report in the bank, we have $1,824.35. We received a whopping big 8 cents interest. Yeah, we're not going to spend it all in one place. Don't worry. Don't worry. Secondly, we're looking for a volunteer. If anybody is interested in helping out a little bit, to call people within the group who have no emails. We don't have, we have a pretty good list. We have phone numbers, but we don't have emails for everyone. Everyone, believe it or not, does not email. And so we really would like someone to call and remind them when there's a meeting. If anybody's interested, think about it, speak to me afterwards. We have refreshments. Please make sure you take a cookie home with you, at least one. Take your Swedish Carp and a bottle of water, because if you don't eat the cookies now, they're going to be stale when they come back to you in September. So eat them now while they're still fresh. Hello, glad you could come. Take some cookies. Tonight we're going to talk about my least favorite fish, carp. But Steve is going to make it very interesting. Ready, Steve?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's learn all about how the carp came to be built.
Yeah. So, a couple housekeeping things. Thank you, Martha Ricky, for the cookies and the water.
You're welcome. I stayed up all night baking.
Thank you, Paula Tenney, for the little cups of Swedish fish. If you don't have a cup of Swedish fish, you can grab one. They play an important role during the presentation. You'll see in a minute. Please, please, please watch out for the orange cord that I just stepped over, because if this projector comes down, the Beauchamp Historical Club will have to deplete its checking account to reimburse the Scruple Historical Society. So thanks to Jim Cromback for bringing that over from Scruple. Appreciate it. Interrupt with any questions, and most important, happy birthday, Fred Greeley.
Thank you.
Yeah, celebrate. You don't turn 40 every day. So,
many choices to come to those places like this. My classmate Steve, I picked this presentation.
So out of all the options you have, your first choice was come to a carp presentation.
Okay.
What a great birthday.
Amen.
Okay. Well, my local history presentations typically tell some exciting stories from the 1800s. These are things like gruesome murders, ghosts and spirits, mysterious disappearances, unsolved crimes. Some of you have seen some of these, and they're pretty exciting, I think. You know, I'm not trying to be egotistical or anything, but you know, this stuff's pretty exciting. I just want to manage your expectations. We're not going to have any of that tonight, so this is going to be quite boring. You know, tonight you're going to hear more about a bit more tame, although wild fish, specifically the German carp, known today as the common carp. But as always, what I try to do is I try to explain the events of the 1800s and how they influence the everyday lives of people living in and around Baldwinsville. That to me is the most interesting part. It's like the story's the story, but what was it like to live around here 200 years ago, and how did events, both local and national, influence how people live? And there you have a German carp. So here's how to identify the German carp. I think it's important that we do this first and foremost. A lot of people probably don't know much about the carp, except to Martha's point, it can be disgusting to some people, it can be a prize to others. It's either a garbage fish or a game fish, depending on who you are. The German carp typically lives from 9 to 15 years, but it's lived as long as 47 years in captivity. It typically weighs 10 to 15 pounds, but it's been up to 60 pounds caught. Okay, so like a small dog. And they put up in a tremendous fight. And they take a long time to land, and I say that from one experience that I had. In comparison, the Swedish fish has a smaller dorsal fin. It has an undivided tail, a Swedish brand logo, and it's typically for immediate consumption, so it doesn't last very long, and it weighs less than 1/10 of an ounce. So that's important to know if you're going out in the wild, whether you're confronting a German carp or a Swedish fish. That's really important. They can tend to taste a little sweeter too. Yeah, they don't fight very much. Look, now let's turn to a little history. Early missionaries, and here are two: Simon Le Moyne, a Jesuit missionary, mid-1600s, and Joseph Chameau, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, another Jesuit missionary, actually visited the area back in the 1600s and were trying to preach to the Haudenosaunee. And Father Le Moyne said that in 1654, Onondaga Lake abounded with fish, with salmon, with trout, and with eel. The Seneca River was teeming with eel. In the same lake in the following year, 1655, Father Chameau said, beside the fish which are taken there at different times of the year, the eel is so abundant there in the autumn that some take with a harpoon as many as 1,000 in a single night. So it's pretty clear that if you go back far enough, let's say some 400 years, and even less than that, the Seneca River was pretty chock full of game fish. It's probably not as chock full today. Our namesake, William Beauchamp found evidence of a Haudenosaunee fish weir west of Dead Creek. In 1908, he wrote that even in rivers, the shallow rifts were commonly sought as favoring spearing. You can see Haudenosaunee there spearfishing from a canoe in a demonstration early in the 20th century. And at these stone fish weirs, they were often constructed shore to shore with bays forming acute angles. And then he went on to say that the remains of many of these fish weirs, they were up and down the river, can be seen 4 miles west of Baldwinsville. So right there, you can see there's Dunham Road, Emmerich Road, Whispering Oaks, Seneca Estates, and then you've got Kamain Road, Dead Creek, Button Shores Road. If you go to the end of Button Shores Road and it hooks to the west, there was a fish weir in the river that as late as the 1880s and 90s was clearly visible to people. And why was that still visible in the river? What hadn't happened yet to the river? Does anybody know? There was a dam, but there was no barge canal yet. And so when the barge canal went in 1910, it raised the level of the water west of the dam, like of the lock, like it did everywhere, including Phoenix. And so it wiped out that fish weir and it became invisible. And it also did something to Dead Creek that we're gonna talk about in a second. So here we have Dead Creek on the left, or the Dead Creek area. That's a topographical map around 1900. And you can see back then it was a pretty powerful stream, and it flowed into the Seneca River. There was no swampy area there. On the right, you can see the Seneca River as it looks, well, somewhat today. And you can see what the barge canal did to that mouth of the Dead Creek. It's now a swampy area. It's very high and it's not very navigable. The source of Dead Creek is kind of interesting. I didn't find this out until I was hiking the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal is right down in here, the old Erie Canal. And there's a creek that flows north from Elbridge called White Bottom Creek. And that's the source of Dead Creek. Now, Dead Creek does get some intake from Whiskey Hollow and some of these streams here, but its real source is in the town of Elbridge from White Bottom Creek. And Tony Christopher, Town of Van Buren historian, said that Dead Creek was earlier called Camp Brook because the Indians came up from the south through this valley, building their lodges on the west side. And there were 2 Indian villages, Haudenosaunee villages, right east of 690 Bridge, one on the south side of the river, one on the north side of the river where Indian Springs is now. They remained here through the pleasant weather while working their fishing grounds on the Seneca River. Again, building the barge canal raised the river and created a swampy area at the delta of the creek. They'd been long gone by then, but it pretty much ruined those fishing grounds. But by 1908, Beauchamp was already lamenting the loss of native fish stocks in the local area. We talked about the trout and the salmon and the eel. A lot of them were gone by then, or most of them were gone by then. Unfortunately, industrialization and overfishing had depleted many of the game fish that were here hundreds of years before. Beauchamp wrote that owing to changes in the water caused by various manufactories to the diminution of food and wasteful and indiscriminate fishing, the food supply is not to be compared, the fish supply, with that of earlier days. By stocking streams and by protective laws, something has been done to repair the waste, but conditions are so changed that primitive abundance is now impossible. You know, on the left, that's the 6-story Amos mill. On the right, anybody know what mill that is? Who said Frazee? Yes, Frazee Mill. That was Amos was the largest mill in town. Frazee was the largest flour mill in town, and you can see running between them a railroad. Together with the dam, this kind of wreaked havoc, you know, on the fish stocks in this section of the river because you had a lot of pollution, you had a lot of outflow from the mills, and the dam made it very, very difficult for the fish to get up and down the river. Let's see. You can also see the man on the right side of the photo here. This was a catch of pike from the Seneca River. Obviously, back then, there were no limits on how many game fish you could take. I didn't count, but there's a lot of pike in there. The guy on the right is a guy named Stu Devendorf, and for 40 years, he was the proprietor of the Riverside Hotel in Baldwinsville. Does anybody know where the Riverside Hotel was?
Lot 24.
No. I remember the Riverside Inn, the bar, but no, this was different. It was the site of the former Kenmar Hotel across from the Beagle Dine. So for 40 years he ran that as the Riverside Hotel, probably a somewhat different establishment from what it became. But anyway. You know, back in 1871, some, 30 years, 40 years before Beauchamp, one man warned that overfishing posed a threat to our entire country. Before Beauchamp in Baldwinsville, he was concerned about overfishing, but on a commercial basis and nationwide. He wrote to Congress calling attention to the problem of depletion of food fish of the seacoasts and lakes in the United States and offering suggestions for remedial measures. In part, he wrote that during my last visit to New England, I was much impressed by the great diminution in numbers of the food which furnished the summer food supply to the coast as compared with their abundance during a previous visit in 1863. I found the same impression to be almost universal. The belief is everywhere loudly expressed that unless some remedy be applied, the time is not far distant when we shall lose almost entirely the source of subsistence and support, a calamity which would leave a vast number of evils in its train. At the time, you got to remember, I mean, the New England fishing grounds were a major food source for much of New England, in fact, the entire country. The Great Lakes as well, with more domestic fish. After some debate, Congress established the U.S. Fish and Fisheries Commission. According to the congressional record, the joint resolution proposing a study of the problem of overfishing in New England had a difficult time in the House. Surprise, surprise. Representative Farnsworth over there, who doesn't look very happy, was from the Midwest. He was from Illinois. He wasn't real interested in the problems of New England, as you might imagine. Pork barrel was a big thing at the time. He wanted to also add to the resolution an investigation of grasshoppers and potato bugs. The committee chairman responded, "My friend from Illinois may think this is a subject of no importance whatever or ridicule, but I assure him that along the coasts of New Jersey and New York and all up our coast to the British possessions, this is a matter of vital importance, this being the depletion of the fish stocks." Farnsworth simply replied, "So is the potato bug." So he wasn't real interested in helping out with fish. He looks a bit obstinate, but something's never changed. Anyway, the resolution passed, and in 1871, Ulysses S. Grant, president, appointed Spencer Fullerton Baird, the first U.S. Fish and Fisheries Commissioner. He had been assistant secretary to the Smithsonian, and fish culture became his passion for the rest of his career, and it was a long one. Does anyone know the name of this government agency now whose flag appears up there? What's the Fish and Fisheries Commission today? U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, right. It's part of the Department of the Interior, and that's what it became. Now, it was clear, that immigration alone was going to soon overwhelm our native fish stocks. The timing of Baird's appointment and the creation of this commission was important that the problem would only get worse and get worse fast. In the period of 1855 to 1864, we had over 5 million immigrants to the United States. You know, some 20 years later, it had more or almost doubled to 10 million immigrants. At the same time, fish stocks, as measured by New England cod landings, dropped from about 700,000 metric tons, excuse me, all the way down to less than 500,000 metric tons. So it's pretty easy to do the math that, you know, we had many more mouths to feed, but far fewer fish to feed them. It's also important to note that most immigrants at the time were arriving to where? Where were they coming to the United States to be processed? New York, Boston, Philadelphia were overwhelmingly the sites of immigration. That's where the fish stocks were. So these people were arriving right where the most pressure was being put on these precious fish stocks. Now, interestingly enough, and you got to look for these things to find them, by 1875, 1/3 of all immigrants to the United States were from Germany. And they loved German carp, Martha. They thought it was a delicacy. Back in Germany, they served carp at weddings, at Christmas, New Year's, birthdays, and according to one source, when they arrived here, they assumed that the land of milk and honey would have carp as well. They asked for carp at fish markets and found that the fish didn't exist here in the United States. Incensed, many wrote to the government and demanded that this new fish commission make carp available. By 1880, Germans were writing 2,000 letters a year to the fish commission, begging them to start cultivating carp in the United States. This is from an actual antique carp cookbook from Germany. Doesn't it look delicious? Like, there's probably... Yeah. I think the cat actually, though, isn't feasting on the carp. He's going for something probably a little more savory down there. But you can see the translations. This is a cookbook for carp and other freshwater fish. On the right, that translation is, carp tastes delicious when there's an R in the month. So you got to be careful when you go to get it. So what did Baird do? Spencer Baird, now he's the first commissioner of the U.S. fisheries. He's got this pressure from all these German immigrants. He's got pressure on our fish stocks, our domestic fish stocks. He turns to Europe, because in Europe, you know, as I said, in Germany and much of Eastern Europe, carp was a delicacy, and it was being cultivated in the millions to feed people in Germany. So he hired this guy named Dr. Rudolf Hessel from Germany as superintendent of carp culture. In 1877, he arrived on the ship Wiesert from Bremen with 345 carp of different varieties for the United States Fish Commission. He said the best carp were to be found in the region of the Danube River, because it was characterized by the elevated, fleshy, and compressed back of the fish, a rapid growth, and delicious flesh, which I think is probably more of an acquired taste. There were 3 dominant varieties of German carp, or European carp. One was the scale carp, the mirror carp, and the leather carp. And the one that we know today in the Seneca River and beyond, at least in the eastern United States, is derived from this scale carp here. If you see a carp in the river, it's going to look a lot like that, only bigger. So,
We do have a few mirror carp. They've been caught in the tournaments.
Yeah, occasionally they'll catch a mirror carp, and it's pretty rare, but it's pretty exciting when they do. So today's German carp, or common carp as we know it, is a direct descendant of that fish there, one of 345 that Hessel brought over on this boat from Germany. So if you catch a carp in the river, you know, there's his great-great-great-great-grandfather or something like that. What's interesting is, you know, Hessel set up a very, very complicated and sophisticated breeding grounds. In Europe, they had carp ponds. They typically weren't dammed up rivers. They typically were on level ground. But he carved out these lakes, you know, at the base of the Washington Monument. And he dug these ponds just for the purpose of propagating fish, primarily carp, about the same time the Washington Monument was being finished. So you can see the monument there in 1879 isn't quite done. There's the Babcock Lakes. You know, 10 years later, there's those Babcock Lakes. And there's the finished Washington Monument. And this is right where all the carp in the United States were bred for many years before they were shipped out to the States for distribution to farmers, right in those Babcock lakes. So that's where they came from. And in 1879, they soon had produced over 6,000 carp fingerlings that were shipped to 273 applicants in 24 states, and the spread of carp to America had begun. They're also very prolific. They reproduce like crazy, so you don't have to breed too many of them before you have a lot of carp for very long. It's interesting, these lakes became kind of a health hazard, and later in the century, Congress voted to fill them in and get rid of the carp ponds. We didn't need ponds anymore, they were everywhere. And ironically, the guy who had them filled in, his name was Fish. So I think you should know. True. In a harbinger of things to come, these carp ponds or Babcock lakes overflowed during the Johnstown flood. The Johnstown flood was horrific. You may remember that from history, 1889. Just about destroyed. A dam broke and a reservoir flooded the river, and almost the entire city of Johnstown was destroyed. What people forget is that downstream, the Potomac River fed Washington, D.C., and this is what it looked like in 1889. You can see people canoeing around Missouri and Maine avenues and over on 6th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. And what's interesting, according to one source, a carp 2 feet long was caught in the ladies' waiting room at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station. So you can imagine these genteel ladies from D.C., probably politicians' wives, were going to catch a train, and there's a 2-foot carp right there, probably freaking out. Several others were caught in the streets by boys. These fish came from the government fish ponds, the waters of the Potomac having covered the pond and allowed them to escape. And in just a few years, history shows again and again how nature points out the folly of man. This would happen a little closer to home and closer to our story. Hessel sent New York State, this guy Dr. Rudolph Hessel started distributing the carp. He sent New York State 10,000 carp for distribution in 1888 at 20 per person. The New York State Fishery Commission even had its own train car for transporting these live fish in giant tanks, primarily carp. R.B. Roosevelt was on the original, he originated the bill that created the U.S. Fish and Fisheries Commission in 1871. By 1886, he was on the New York State Commission, and the president of the commission was a guy named E.G. Blackford right there. What's interesting is in 1888, they started promoting the fact that they had these fish and they wanted farmers to start ordering them. And they said these fish are for distribution in the state. All persons desiring to stock ponds with carp will be furnished with 20 fish by sending to the undersigned, Babcock, their names, addresses, and 25 cents to pay for the kettle in which they're shipped. So, so for only a quarter, you could have your own proverbial kettle of fish. And it did turn out to be a kettle of fish. It became big business. Many books promoted carp in the 1880s, largely to cash-strapped farmers nationwide. Why were the farmers cash-strapped? Well, the Panic of 1873 was a financial crisis that triggered an economic depression that lasted 5 years. After the Panic of 1837, it was the biggest economic depression we'd ever experienced in the country, and was called the Great Depression only until the events in 1929 and the early 30s eclipsed it, and then that became the Great Depression. So, these carp growing manuals helped American farmers supply the growing demand of German immigrants for German carp. By this time, Central New Yorkers had fully embraced the idea of carp farming on a large scale. In 1886, one Syracuse paper said that the most serious lack to the present variety of rural diet is that of fresh fish. The only way to remedy this defect is for every farmer to have his own fish pond. The fish above all for the farmer to cultivate is the German carp. So you had these books coming out. You had the local papers and authorities encouraging farmers to grow German carp. And the next year, that same paper reported that many new ponds are being started this year, and it's only a matter of time before German carp from them will be on the market. They're an excellent eating fish and well worth raising. So what happened? Obviously, farmers jumped at the chance. They were cash-strapped. Some of them were losing their farms, and they supplemented their grain crops and dairy crops and other things with pisciculture. One of the streams feeding Dead Creek was the perfect spot for a carp pond. There were really two types of carp ponds at the time. You could have a farm field, spring-fed, and you dig your own pond. or it could be fed by a very steep stream. Now, we knew that Dead Creek at the time was the perfect spot for a carp pond, because in January of 1890, the Baldwinsville paper reported that there were in the vicinity of Baldwinsville several magnificent springs. On the Memphis Road, now East Dead Creek Road, several brooks make out of the hills. They all abounded in trout a few years ago. A beautiful one around the Damon Barnes place makes out of the hillside near the creek. The flow of water from it is immense. It does not change in quantity from one year's end to another. Drought does not seem to affect it. One man has recently made a dam across it, and a pond of water is the result, in which he has had the sagacity to place 1,000 German carp. So right up here on the Barnes property, on this little stream, this little creek, and over here, this is 1860, 1874. The Mulvey farm was just below it. Somebody had a carp pond built into the side of the hill, fed by a pretty steep creek with 1,000 carp in it. These fish will fatten and grow in the water, but the carp needs a good deal of vegetable matter on which it can subsist. He also wants some mud, quite agreeable to his nature, in which he can frolic. And so these maps show the spot on the left and the right where it took place. Again, the stream in question flowed between the two homesteads on the north and the south. By the way, the Mulvey house would become home to a man named Rouse by 1890, and that's where he comes into our story. So what do we know about this carp enthusiast? His name was George Rouse. He was an inventor and an entrepreneur. And I kind of sense that from this picture over here, he kind of may have shirked some work. Here's some men hewing timber circa 1890. Doesn't look like easy work. Guess which one is Rouse? Yeah, he's not the guy with the axe. He's the guy standing on the sled waiting to drive the horses away. That's George Rouse. Anyway, Tony Christopher interviewed some of his descendants and found that several small industries were in operation here in the 1890s through the efforts of George Rouse. He was a sort of inventor. He tried his skill at perfecting perpetual motion machines, but did not succeed. He manufactured a kind of sulky plow or one on wheels, and he sold some in the neighborhood. He made sauerkraut in a barn across the road. He also made a powerful windmill, which with a long rope conveyed power to the barn for cutting corn stalks. Maybe George Rouse's perpetual motion clocks couldn't keep running. Perhaps his revolutionary plow invention didn't materialize, but George had great faith and was certain that one of his brainchild ideas would reach success. So what was that brainchild idea? It was raising carp. Rouse likely consulted a carp farming book, one of the four that I showed you, to convert the stream into a pond. On the left is a plan showing the construction, okay, of a pond in a ravine supplied with creek water, requiring a dam at the lower end and a deflecting channel for taking care of the creek water, an intake outlet, a pipeline, and a drain. On the right, the diagram shows a small valley surrounded by hills. A creek runs across the valley or through it, and the farmer concludes to make a carp pond on the spot. Rouse probably planned well. If he was an innovator and an entrepreneur and an inventor, I'm sure he took this very seriously and did everything he could to replicate what the experts were telling him was the best way to make a pond in a steep ravine. And I got to tell you, you've probably been out on East Dead Creek Road. It is not level ground. These ravines, these streams are very, very steep. So his pond was probably planned very well and looked like one of the two shown here. But in the prophetic words of Tony Christopher, George Rouse never thought of disaster. No one ever does. Sure enough, disaster did burst his dream and his dam, spilling carp into Dead Creek. In February 1892, the Baldwinsville paper reported that a good many German carp have found their way into Dead Creek by the breaking away of the dam, so believed from the fact that an immense number of fry were forced into the creek by the large volume of water that proceeded from the dam, and there were some very large carp also. The creek will be a fine place for them, and they are said to be a good table fish. Let them increase. Well, we know what happened. They did increase with reckless abandon, I would say. So if you want to trace the origin of the German or common carp in the Seneca River, Onondaga Lake, parts in between, the only record we have is George Rouse, his dam on East Dead Creek Road, and his loss of at least 1,000 fish into the Seneca River. This is where it happened. Now, I have to admit, that's not 1890. Either is that. Thanks. That's Google. So thank you very much, Google. Within weeks, sure enough, you know, it didn't take long for them to reproduce. Folks began catching big carp in Dead Creek and the Seneca River. In early March 1892, we're just talking like 4 weeks from the dam bursting, the Baldwinsville paper reported it's presumed that there are quite a number of German carp in Dead Creek and perhaps in the Seneca River. Later that year in June, it reported that C. Warner caught a German carp in Dead Creek last week, which weighed 6 pounds. Now, these were fingerlings, right? They grew that fast. The fish was a beauty. It will be remembered that we gave an account of the breaking away of the pond on the Walker farm. The carp was one of the many that made its way into the creek. Another article reported that a German carp weighing 16 pounds and 9 ounces was captured in Dead Creek Wednesday night by Willis Walker. You're talking only 5 to 6 months later now. So from fingerling, the size of your thumb, to 6 pounds to 16 pounds in 6 months. They are prolific and they are voracious eaters. Isaiah Harrington there has shown him fishing the Seneca River near Dead Creek. He's actually one of the first supervisors of the town of Van Buren, tragically killed by felling a tree, which fell on him and killed him. Will Marvin was an avid fisherman in Belgium. I don't think that's a carp. I've been told that's a sheep's head, but you get the idea. Then the last article said a German carp weighing 16 pounds was captured in Dead Creek. The head was on exhibition at our office this morning and attracted much attention. So clearly back in the, late 1890s, there wasn't a lot to do in Baldwinsville. People felt compelled to get out to the Gazette office and look at a dead carp's head on the wall, because I'm not really interested in going anywhere to look at a dead carp's head. But apparently it was interesting. Now, I have a real historic find for you. I don't know how I happened on this, but I found an old film that shows what may have happened after the carp escaped into the Seneca River. You're seeing this for the first time here at the Beauchamp Historical Club. It looks something like this. Who says that history can't be fun? Now, I've never seen Carp do this, but, I'm not going to question the accuracy of the film. Uh-oh. All right, we got a problem. Okay, clearly that's not the film I had in mind, but that's going to have to do for tonight. Maybe it didn't look exactly like that, but you get the idea. So, little levity doesn't hurt, right? Unfortunately, you heard a lot of advice from people: grow carp, they reproduce fast, they're going to solve our food problem, they're easy to grow, supplement your income. It didn't take very long before people figured out that carp also pose problems. Like every invasive species we've ever brought to America, it has unintended consequences. There was a group called the Onondaga County Farmers Club. They were kind of an irascible group. It included members like Wallace Tappan from right here in Baldwinsville, the Tappan family, Nelson Ritter, a guy from Syracuse, and I found an article in 1898 that members of the local farmers club began to bash the poor carp. One paper reported that at a meeting to discuss fish farming, a few questions were asked. One by Mr. Tappan drew from the speaker the opinion that the German carp, lately developed in considerable abundance in the Seneca River, is a hideous fish, unfit for food, a gross feeder, and very destructive to other fish. Which is reasonable and understandable and probably quite true. But then it went on from there. The carp is certainly a great eater and exceedingly fond of the vegetable diet. Martin Montague of Baldwinsville declares that it sometimes gets out into the meadows at the nighttime and eats off the clover, which I find very hard to believe. Martin Montague was a fisherman who lived in a houseboat on the river and was known to frequent the inns and taverns on a regular basis, so we got to kind of take it for what it's worth. But Nelson Ritter did not want to be outdone. He went one step further and swore that he saw them climbing apple trees to take apples out of the trees. So they had it out for the carp and started inventing fairy tales. Didn't like the carp. Over time, it got even worse. Other tales exaggerated the carp's appetite and destructive nature. These are both newspaper articles from upstate New York in the early 20th century, I want to say the early 1900s. Fish caught in the garden eating carrot tops. It's kind of like we all have to worry about when we plant our gardens whether carp are going to be crawling around. You know, somebody found the river overflowed and they found a 15-pound German carp making breakfast of carrot tops. He killed it with a spade. Several farmers said the carp had done serious damage by feeding on their lettuce and asparagus beds. They set a number of fish traps in the flooded section and baited them with, of course, what else? Brussels sprouts, which he said no carp could resist. So, I don't know about that. I'm not going to read this whole thing here, but apparently there was a woman in the Delaware River who went boating. Her boat got towed out of control by a giant fish. They thought it was a sturgeon. The chase lasted several minutes before they could get alongside. A big fish was brought to the surface. The men belabored the monster with oars and stones to stun it. It was a German carp weighing 28 pounds and 4 ounces, the biggest specimen ever taken from these waters. Now that's bad enough that a 28-pound German carp could tow a boat. I doubt that, but they say it was true. But to make matters even more unbelievable, they said that some years ago a carp swallowed a pug puppy, the pet of a city boarder, which fell out of the boat. I assume the pet, not the boarder. Her catch is believed to be the fish that swallowed the dog. This catch over here was the one that swallowed the dog, because guess what they found inside the fish? They found a buckle similar to those attached to dog collars in its stomach. So I don't know if I believe that. But, so, you know, this carp that was brought into the country to feed people and looked like to be the answer to our dreams, like a lot of invasive species, has unintended consequences and leads to much worse situations. So what did the U.S. Fish Commission do in the face of all this incredible criticism after they'd gone to great lengths to bring the carp to the United States to feed all these German immigrants and others? They issued a bulletin, as the government is wont to do, eat the carp, right, in 1911. I'm going to read it briefly. The carp discovered America in 1877. He found the land to his liking. He multiplied and filled the waters with his kind. He is now big, abundant, and useful. He converts useless vegetation and small animals into meat. It is easily digestible. It can be cooked in such a way to remove the muddy taste. It can be boiled, baked, made into croquettes or fish loaf. Here's my favorite, carp jelly. An ancient Swedish dish is delicious. There are millions of carp in the U.S. The last census shows that 43 million pounds were marketed in 1 year. They arrived here in 1877. By 1911, 43 million pounds. Nearly all of this came from a few states in the Midwest, but also in New York State. Somebody had to eat these 43 million pounds of carp, therefore it must be good to eat. The carp is good to eat. It's not only been eaten, but been cultivated in Europe for centuries. Europeans know how to cook it, catch the carp, buy the carp, cook the carp properly and eat it. Eat the roe, can the roe, make carp jelly, can the fish, smoke it too. For information and recipes, write to the United States Bureau of Fisheries. So I don't know how many people took them up on that, but that was an early attempt to alter the diet of Americans. You know, on the other side of the coin, no matter how hard the government tried, you had articles like this one, which appeared in multiple papers throughout England. I found it in many papers. In 1911, the same year this little broadside came out from the government, a speaker at a literary dinner in New York said, he was making an allusion or an analog. He said, you know, the recipe for cooking German carp, well, you catch a German carp in a stagnant, muddy stream, clean it immediately, hang it in the sun 3 days to dry. After it's thoroughly dried, nail it to a spruce board, cover it with a paste of salt and mud, let it stand 2 days longer. Now bake it 48 hours, remove the nails, scrape off the salt and the mud paste carefully, and then eat the board, never eat the carp. So the jury's out on how appetizing these carp were at the time. Clearly it was already starting to take on a very bad reputation in the United States after such wonderful efforts by the U.S. Fish Commission. What happened 7 years later after 1911? Big event worldwide? World War I. Who were we fighting in World War I? The Germans. Who originated the carp? The Germans. So what happened? The carp became an icon for German aggression, and the poor carp got it even worse. So in World War I, both German beer and German carp were easy targets of anti-German sentiment. In Milwaukee, they were dumping out German barrels of beer, which ultimately led to prohibition very quickly. The Buffalo Evening News in 1917, they had a political cartoon on the left. You can see Uncle Sam there doing his part to save the world by seining the carp, the German carp, out of the streams of the world. And the quote was, did the German carp learn it from the Kaiser, or the Kaiser learn it from the carp? Isn't it an uncanny coincidence that it should happen to be that the German carp, which when introduced into a stream, will drive out all the fish from the waters, only by the most persistent seining out of the carp, have been able to retain any of the native fish life, seine the carp, which was a not so obscure allusion to get rid of any Germans that are in the country. So it was pretty anti-German sentiment. Another article from 1918 went even farther. They said the carp is an enemy alien. He was sneaked into our good American streams years ago, a clear case of German propaganda. We did not know so much about Germans and German carp then as we do now. If it were printable, what we have since learned about Germans would fill a library, and what our American anglers have learned about German carp would fill another. The streams have been ravaged by carp, and there is hardly a decent, self-respecting American fish left in them. It goes on from there, but you get the idea. So the carp are eliminating all the wonderful American game fish that we have. The carp never really recovered from its connection to German aggression. German Americans obviously suffered, but German carp were an easy target. You know, during the 1830s, carp were seined and sold in New York City as Onondaga Lake whitefish. You know, local anglers still despise the carp. At the time, it still, by the mid-1900s, had a terrible reputation as a garbage fish, a bottom feature, a destroyer of fish habitat. They'd muddy the waters, and vegetation would die, and the game fish would die off. And so they really weren't held in high esteem. But that didn't prevent people from harvesting them and sending them downstate, where people in New York City still thought of them as a delicacy known as whitefish. On the left, spectators gathered near the railroad bridge on the Parkway to watch a group of fishermen cast a large net. 2 men in boats are spreading the net when 5 men hold the net close to shore. Niagara Mohawk's gas tower, you know, down by the harbor now, is visible in the background. This picturesque body of water located in central New York has been infested with numerous carp and is now being made a better place for fishing. Right there you can see the old trolley line. My grandmother used to tell me stories about taking the trolley into the city. And all along the way, what did she see along Onondaga Lake toward Liverpool, between Liverpool and Geddes? The salt vats. Remember the salt? That's right. The caption that goes with the one on the right says, 4 men use a boat to gather a net full of fish about to be taken from the waters of Onondaga Lake. These carp will grace the tables of our friends in New York City as Onondaga Lake whitefish. These fish, known as German carp, are being seined from Onondaga Lake and shipped to New York City fish markets, where they're sold as Onondaga Lake whitefish. So again, nobody around here wanted to fish for them. Nobody around here wanted to eat them. But there was profit to be made by shipping them downstate, where they were still considered a delicacy. By that time, there still was a fair amount of immigration from Eastern Europe and Germany, and people held the fish in high esteem down there. Now we can fast forward to Beeville and to the 17th annual Wild Carp Classic tournament in May. You know, back in 2005, somebody had the brainstorm of, you go outside the United States, you go to Asia, you go to Eastern Europe. Carp are a delicacy. Carp fishing is a profession. People are professional carp fishers. There are tons of tournaments where people catch carp. Somebody put 2 and 2 together and said, we have a lot of carp in the river, we don't know what to do with them, they're potentially destructive to game fish. We have all these people outside the U.S. that would pay good money to come and fish for them. And so that's exactly what happened. A local article has said that 36 teams participated in the last year's tournament, 2022, spread out in 3 sections along the Seneca River, Onondaga Lake Outlet, New Long Branch Park, and a new section along the west shore of Onondaga Lake. Past Wild Carp Club tournaments included as many as 50 teams, but organizers limited the 2022 Spring Classic to 36. The top 3 teams in each of 3 sections divvied up $34,000 in prize money. Over 4 sleepless days, anglers landed 430 carp, totaling 9,182 pounds. That's 4.5 tons. With the average fish weighing 21 pounds, the largest fish caught tipped the scales at 34 pounds and 14 ounces. Again, the size of a large dog. So these carp, literally, that's a scale carp or common carp, is literally probably a descendant of one of the fish that escaped from George Rouse's pond in 1892. And maybe not too long ago, it might be a grandson. They live for up to 50 years sometimes. So anyway, you know, you can still maybe go back and see where this pond was located up on the western hill over Easthead Creek Road between Connors Road and Hogue Road. You know, Tony Christopher wrote prolifically about local history in Van Buren. He wrote 2 articles about this topic, which I borrowed generously from, but he went back up and found remnants of the carp pond after it was long emptied in 1966. I went back, you know, some 45 years later and found it pretty hard to decipher, but you can still see the walls where he had taken, George Rouse had taken a steep ravine and built the dam and created a carp pond. What he didn't count on was the February thaw, the pressure against the dam, and disaster that surely struck. So that's what it looks like today. I'm running pretty short. I hope that's okay, but I do have my own fish story to tell. That's 5 years ago. I was vacationing with my 13-year-old daughter in Andrews, North Carolina, up in the mountains. They had a big fish pond, and the couple there, the older couple that lived there, said, you know, we got a couple rods and reels. You can go out and catch some fish if you want. There's a really big carp out there nobody's ever caught. You know, you're probably not going to get it. Sure enough, about 7 o'clock one night, we got a major hit. It took us almost an hour to land that carp. It took 2 of us. It took 2 nets, her holding one, me holding the other on either end, and dragging it up on shore. It's nowhere near the gargantuan from that shot there, but I estimated he was about 32 inches and about 20 pounds, and he put up an amazing fight. So if you've never gone carp fishing, I highly recommend it. They are a wily fish to catch, and a lot of people consider them a delicacy. And so that's a little bit about how carp came to be in Baldwinsville, and hopefully you know a little bit more about it. And if you like them, go, join the carp tournament, try to land one of them. If you don't like them, blame George Rouse back in 1892 for a failed experiment gone wrong.
So did you cook them?
I did not cook the carp. No. That I throw all my fish back in the water. I have a camp on the Seneca River just south of Phoenix. I fish with live bait from shore. I don't catch anything very big. I don't fish for carp because they don't really go for live bait. You typically want to have something that's on the bottom. My neighbor, who's really good at this, has a special kind of Polish bread. They're immigrants from Poland, and his wife bakes this bread specifically for catching carp. They roll it into balls, they put it on hooks, they drop it on the bottom, and it takes sometimes 2 or 3 days before you get a hit. And I will tell you, they are very, very hard to land. They're strong. But no, I've never eaten a carp, but I look forward to it someday. In the meantime, I'm going to have some Swedish fish. So I didn't know if anybody had any questions about how carp came to be in the river, or the experiment that George Rouse had, any of this stuff.
What did they do with all the fish from the tournament? Did it all go back in? I mean,
It was all catch and release.
Yeah, catch it. They have to catch and release them. Yeah, that is. So they're there for the next year, and they only get bigger. Yeah. Now, one thing I didn't bring up was there is something called Asian carp, although they've been renamed for certain reasons. They are not around here yet. It's become the scourge of the Mississippi River Basin. Right now, the canal system on the Mississippi River going up through Chicago and other parts into the Great Lakes are desperately, desperately trying to keep these Asian carp from getting into the Great Lakes. Once they get into the Great Lakes, they will come here. The German carp has reached the point where it can peacefully coexist with trout, with salmon, with bass, pike, walleye, pickerel, you name it, all the game fish. The scientists have pretty much established carp don't really damage the river bottom as much as people thought. They certainly don't feed on other fish. They're bottom feeders, they're scavengers, they eat whatever they find on the bottom. So they're really not a harm to game fish. Asian carp, on the other hand, which are new invasive species that landed in America not too long ago, there are 4 different types. They look very, very different from this carp. They're on their way up the Mississippi and they are wreaking havoc with food stocks on the Mississippi. They do predate on game fish, and they do terrible destruction to the river habitat all up and down the Mississippi River Basin. I think it's only a matter of time that the Asian carp make it into the Great Lakes, down the Oswego to the Oneida River, Onondaga Lake, the Seneca River. We're going to have to deal with them at some point, probably in the next decade. And they make these guys look like puppy dogs.
Steve, is the Asian carp like the snakefish?
No, a
The one that
snakefish.
gets out of the water?
Right, a snakefish is a distinctly different species. I've caught them. You're instructed by the DEC to immediately execute them on shore and kill them and separate the head from the body. They are predators. They'll eat anything, including game fish. There's also something called the brown goby now fish, which was an aquarium fish,
Right.
which has been released. I've caught 3 of them now. They're only about as long as your index finger. But they too grow and are terrible predators and very destructive. So
It's like the 5 pounds.
exactly. Right. So invasive species are becoming a real problem in the United States. This is one that I think over time, I think the panic and the paranoia and the desperation was all unfounded. These fish, again, they peaceably coexist with all the game fish that are out there. I've got probably hundreds of these in the bay right in front of my river, and they don't impede catching game fish at all from a boat or from shore. They're on the bottom. They're actually cleaning up the bottom of whatever falls to the bottom, so they're pretty good fish. Other questions?
Did George Rouse rebuild his dam after that and continue or not?
He did not.
Gave it up?
Yep, he probably moved back to sauerkraut, perpetual motion machines, supplies. But no, he was an inventor and an innovator, and I think he was the kind of guy that if something failed, he kind of moved on to the next thing. Jim?
I have a question, not about the carp, but something else in the program. Do we know how Dead Creek got its lovely name and why?
I do not. The only thing I think I may recall, again from Tony Christopher, as we said, it used to be called Camp Brook by the Haudenosaunee because it was abundant fishing grounds, because it was a flowing stream into the river, not a swamp. I think that when the barge canal was put in, it pretty much killed the creek because it got so swampy. It became less prolific, and I think that's when it got termed Dead Creek. So I don't see any references to it as Dead Creek until about 1900, and the canal went in 1910. That's what I think. Before that, it was called Camp Brook.
I was hoping there would be a murder involved.
I know.
That's another story.
I'll try to think of a murder I can insert here somewhere. I warned you up front, no murders, mysterious disappearances, ghosts, spirits, unsolved crimes. But I'm doing one in October for the Schuylkill Historical Society, and I'll try to put one of everything in that one. Other questions?
Has anybody else gone carp fishing? No? Nobody's gone carp fishing?
Years ago, when I was a kid.
Yeah, years ago,
Yeah.
my brother went to me, because he knows I come here, he's the one that told me to come here, and he goes, I brought it up on the phone, he goes, well, we're seeing the same carp again, no way, I thought they were native in the area.
No.
He said, Richard, my friend Richard, and I used to catch those things right behind Fred's Body Shop on Oswego Street, and the Iron Bridge, and sell them for 20 pounds, huge.
Yep,
And
absolutely.
that was in the 60s. It was in the 60s.
Last summer, my neighbor caught one that was probably closer to 30 pounds.
Oh.
It was enormous. It took 2 of us to get it out of the river.
Yeah, that's crazy.
But no, they are not native, although I would say, like a lot of Baldwinsville natives, if you've been here for 150 years, I guess you're a native at this point, so.
You didn't know that.
Yeah. Now, I will tell you, the rigs these guys have, I've got some other photos, are very sophisticated. They actually cast way out in the river. They have an explosive charge on the end of the rig that propels the bait out into the river and down. And their biggest complaint the last 2 years, they pay dearly for these sites along the river. You get reserved a spot. You can see right there. That's his spot, identified. That's right in Lions Park. And they compete for these spots. They're not cheap. they take these really expensive rigs, they cast them way out in the river, the bait explodes and goes even farther out and down, and then what happens? A jet skier comes along, cuts the line, pontoon boats come, and they actually reported last year pontoon boats would come by and spear the carp that these guys had already caught, and then just race off. And these guys don't have boats, so you know there's nothing they can do about it. So
I think they would, block it off
I think it's for the event.
yeah, it's kind of hard. I mean, the Canal Corporation has jurisdiction over the river. They don't stop the boat traffic for the tournament because it's a private tournament. But people are getting frustrated because, bad actors are really interfering in the fish tournament. And these guys are paying good money, and they're looking for some good prize money. And they return all the fish to the river, and these other boaters probably do not. So that's one problem that we have right now. The carp tournament's coming up, the 18th one is just in 2 weeks. All up and down the Seneca River, basically from the dam below Baldwinsville all the way to Onondaga Lake. If you go on the south side of the river, you'll see these guys all along the river. Like I said, 50 to 75 of them. Anyway.
Okay, so now's your chance, people.
Yeah. I think it might be a little late to enroll for this year and buy all your rigs. One guy said he spent $25,000 on his carp rigs. But you have to remember, many of these teams are from overseas. They're Filipino, they're Japanese,
They're in it for the money.
they're Indonesian, they're German, they're from the Baltics, they're Polish, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia. These are delicacies, and I think they may keep the fish that they catch because,
Steve was, right after they converted the Mercer Mill into a motel, the first few years they had a parade. A lot of them, the individuals from all these foreign countries stayed there.
mm,
And I remember coming past my store with all the flags from Europe or
Oh, really?
wherever,
I didn't
Germany,
know
wherever
that.
they came from, yeah.
well, for the first, I want to say almost 10 years, and I can't think of the name right now, Mc something, that owned the Red Mill Inn before it became what it is today. They were the ones that hosted the tournament. And so most people stayed right at the Red Mill Inn. Yeah, and the family hosted it, and I can't think of that, McDermott or something like that, they hosted the tournament. But then now it's hosted by a couple named Russell, and it has nothing to do with the Red Mill Inn.
It's McKenna.
McKenna, thank you.
McKenna's the name.
Josh McKenna, yeah, or Jake McKenna, that's what it is. Yep. Other questions?
Well done.
Basically, the carp ended up being the first fish that changed the whole idea of keeping other species out of the waterways.
Yes.
Yeah, so it was the test case.
It was the canary in the coal mine, and if you start, in the 1800s, nobody knew if you brought, there were other, like European starlings, there were other invasive species that were brought here to solve problems. Carp were brought here to feed immigrants because we didn't have enough food, and our fish stocks were declining, and we were looking at potential starvation. So it was brought here for a very good reason, but like a lot of invasive species that are brought intentionally, it's very hard to look down the road at what the consequences may be.
End up with more serious problems.
Yeah, this one turned out okay, because I think there have been a lot of scientific studies that have demonstrated these carp are not as damaging as people originally thought, either to the habitat or to the game fish. And so they peacefully coexist now. So it's kind of one of those invasive species stories that maybe turned out a little more innocuous than others.
Yeah, but they were the test case,
Right.
which now we know
Right.
much more about.
You brought up the pythons in Florida.
Yeah.
That's a good example of it's out of control, and they're killing all the native species.
All the mammals are gone.
All the mammals, right.
Well, even the alligators are now having a hard time.
And so, what do you think these 35-foot pythons are going to do when they run out of small
Well,
mammals?
they've already started.
They're going up.
Well, they've
Yeah.
already been found
In fresh water.
in
Salt
salt
water.
water.
Saltwater.
They're not. They're
Well,
not
I think they're
saltwater.
also going to look at people, especially
They've
small
been found in
people.
pools.
Yeah, they're
They're
going to go
all
after.
dogs.
So on that happy note,
The funny thing about the carp is that they brought it here as a food, as a sustenance. And even as a kid, I remember carp was not a desirable fish.
No.
It was icky and muddy and, yeah, you know, like my mom would do. They were cooking there, you know. I don't know, I wonder if that ever changed.
Restaurants have these and people love it.
That's true, Mary. The catfish are bottom feeders, bullhead are bottom feeders, and people do eat those, so.
Yeah.
But they tend to be less bony than a carp. Carp are very bony. They're a little bit hard to clean. There's, you've got more bones per fish. But I will tell you, my neighbor who's lived there for 50 years, his sons in high school would catch carp and then sell them to local Chinese food restaurants. So, if there may be fish in some menu items from ethnic restaurants that include carp
So
local.
it's a summer culture.
Yeah. I think some people outside the U.S. don't have the prejudice against carp that we have, maybe because of its appearance and its reputation and everything else. But, so I challenge you all to go home and have some carp. Or maybe even some of that delicious carp jelly the government wants us all. That's all I've got for tonight. And that's the reason I shaved my beard off right there.
Oh, that was you?
That was me, yeah, absolutely. I do, and not necessarily good. I'd like to have a beard like Jen and Lynn.
Okay, I'd like to remind everybody we have cookies and water. Please take the cookies with you. There's napkins, wrap up too. Everybody wraps up too, we should clean them all up.
Martha, can I recommend one other thing too?
Yes.
If people, Frank, you're here all the time, Bruce, Stu, if you think of topics for next year that you'd like us to explore, that are local and historical in nature, then we can always try to investigate those and present them. So let us know if there's stuff you're interested in, and tell your friends and neighbors, and let's get some more folks.
And if anybody wants to volunteer, make a phone call, just whisper in my ear before you go.
Okay. Like Morris.
Yeah.